Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving into a gripping, high-stakes geopolitical chess match happening right now in Baghdad. It's a massive standoff between the Iraqi state and various armed groups operating within its borders. But you know what makes this situation absolutely fascinating? It's not a threat of military conflict. No, it's the strategic use of bureaucracy, legal framing, and a very specific date on the calendar. We're going to break down exactly how a government is attempting to solve one of its most complex security challenges, not with soldiers, but with statutes.
Okay, let's dive into this. The timeline you're looking at really reveals the whole strategy. The calendar is literally doing the arguing here. Back in 2024, Washington and Baghdad agreed to a two-phase transition to wind down the U.S.-led coalition mission. Phase 1 wraps up at federal Iraqi bases around September 2025. And then Phase 2, which is centered on the Kurdistan region, concludes on September 30, 2026. Now, check out what the Iraqi state did in August 2026. Prime Minister Ali al-Zaidi's government announced a huge consequence for armed groups. Hand over your weapons by September 30, 2026, or face the law. So you have two massive, seemingly unconnected deadlines that are strategically designed to legally collide on exactly the same date.
And that brings us to Baghdad's brilliant strategy. When the state says to these factions, hand over your weapons by September 30th, well, it kind of sounds like a prelude to a military strike, right? But it's not. It is absolutely not a threat of military force. It's a threat of paperwork. See, for years, the public argument from these armed factions has been that their weapons are strictly conditional on the presence of foreign forces. By aligning the disarmament deadline with the exact date the U.S. coalition mission ends, Baghdad is entirely closing that argument. They're effectively saying, look, on October 1st, your justification expires. The state is literally transforming these armed groups from political actors you negotiate with and to criminal defendants to be prosecuted.
Moving on to Section 1, inside or outside the state. Let's figure out what that actually means on the ground.
To really grasp how ambitious this strategy is, we have to understand what it actually means to be a militia in Iraq today. Because, honestly, the line between being inside or outside the state is incredibly blurry. Iraq doesn't just have a simple binary of national army versus rebel militia. Just look at the massive scale of the Popular Mobilization Forces, or the PMF. We are talking about an estimated 238,000 personnel with an annual state budget of up to $2.7 billion US. Under a 2016 law, the PMF is an independent formation that's officially part of Iraq's armed forces, reporting directly to the prime minister. So a huge number of these fighters are technically already inside the state, drawing government salaries. The core dispute? It isn't just about who has guns, it's about which chain of command a unit actually obeys when push comes to shove.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is that despite those massive numbers and that huge state budget, the reality of integration is actually startling. Only 3 specific groups have actually announced their formal integration into the Prime Minister's chain of command. That's Saraya al-Salam, Asaib al-Haq, and Kataib al-Imam Ali. 3 groups, out of dozens of armed factions. The vast majority of them operate under their own independent command structures, even while technically existing within the state's legal framework.
Which brings us to Section 2, the anti-terrorism RER.
This is the exact legal mechanism that Prime Minister Ali al-Zaidi and the State Administration Coalition are threatening to unleash against anyone who refuses to fully integrate. And the tool they've picked up? It's the anti-terrorism law, number 13 of 2005. This is a genuinely formidable piece of legislation with immense historical weight. It's the exact same law Iraq utilized to prosecute ISIS. And now it's being repurposed as a legal ultimatum for unintegrated armed groups. It's absolutely crucial to note that when this August deadline was set by political leaders, the head of the Supreme Judicial Council, Zaidi, was reportedly right there in the room. The judiciary wasn't just informed after the fact, they were present when the decision was made. But using this specific law, it's a high-stakes gamble. UN human rights experts and the American Bar Association have severely criticized this statute for having a seriously overbroad and ambiguous definition of terrorism. Get this, it requires zero proof of terrorist intent. And remarkably, the death penalty is available for offenses that are completely non-lethal, like property damage. So Baghdad has reached for the absolute bluntest, widest tool on the shelf. This makes the threat incredibly credible for sure, because almost any armed act can be charged under it, but it's also highly dangerous. Applying such a broad, sweeping law selectively in a deeply divided country, that's a fast track to stripping the entire legal process of its legitimacy.
That leads us to Section 3, the armed groups case. Let's flip the perspective for a second.
For truly objective analysis,
We need to look across the table and examine the armed group's legitimate legal counterarguments. These factions, they don't view themselves as outlaws at all. They argue the state's conditions simply haven't been met yet. Take a look at this quote from Abu Mujahid al-Asaf, the security chief of Kataib Hezbollah. He stated, "Militant action is today a collective duty." Groups like Kataib Hezbollah completely refuse to even discuss laying down their weapons as long as foreign forces remain deployed anywhere in Iraq, specifically pointing to the coalition's presence up in the Kurdistan region. To them, the timeline for disarmament hasn't even started yet. And this brilliantly illustrates the conceptual deadlock we're looking at. On one side, you have Baghdad's stance. Hand over your weapons by September 30 or face terrorism charges. On the other side, the malicious stance. Our weapons are conditional on the foreign presence, and we need concrete guarantees before we even consider disarmament. Factions like Harkat al-Nujaba point out that they stepped up to fight ISIS when the national army collapsed. They're already legally part of the state. They draw salaries. So from their perspective, handing over their weapons without absolute ironclad guarantees about their status and future, that isn't integration. To them, that's dissolution. So, into Section 4. Can Baghdad enforce it? The arguments are set, but that raises the most practical question of this entire explainer. Can Baghdad actually enforce this ambitious legal maneuver on the ground? Well, to make this work, the government has proposed a massive institutional overhaul. Step 1. Consolidate the popular mobilization forces, federal police, rapid response force, and border guards. Step 2. Form an entirely new single federal security ministry. And Step 3. Establish one unified chain of command for absolutely everyone holding a weapon. Look, it's a logical, comprehensive plan, but it's also a colossal administrative project with an impossibly short runway before that September 30th deadline hits.
And unfortunately, history really isn't on Baghdad's side here. Back in 2019, a decree ordered militias to drop their names, close their political offices, and fold into the national forces. And you know what happened? It went completely unenforced. It just resulted in requests for extensions and ultimately total inaction. It's a really stark reminder that setting a policy in Iraq and actually enforcing it are often two entirely different things. Which leads us to ask this absolutely critical question. Who exactly verifies the disarmament? This is literally the most important piece of the giant puzzle, and right now, it's completely missing. Without independent verification of surrendered bases and weapons, integration is just a cosmetic name change. These groups can easily just shed their old labels, slap on a federal uniform, but keep their guns, their independent command structures, and all their political influence totally intact.
Moving to our final section, Section 5, the ultimate geopolitical test.
Let's get into our final analysis here. If the enforcement is so uncertain and the history is so bleak, what does this September 30th deadline actually accomplish? Well, even if absolutely no military operation happens on that day, the deadline achieved three vital strategic goals for the state. First, it fixes responsibility. It turns an armed group operating outside state command from a vague political headache into a formal criminal issue. Second, it moves the venue. It pulls negotiations out of backroom party offices and threatens to drop them straight into the courts under the anti-terrorism law. The state is essentially forcing the argument onto legal ground that it controls. And third, it projects commitment outward. By publishing a firm date, Baghdad has something tangible to show its international partners, particularly the United States, proving its commitment to sovereign control.
But there is a massive risk here, because a deadline creates a test that just didn't exist before. Think about it. If a state misses a deadline it set for itself, does it lose the very authority it was trying to prove? On October 1st, if the factions haven't disarmed and the state fails to prosecute, Baghdad will have publicly demonstrated the limits of its own power, on a date it chose, in front of the whole world. So keep a very close eye on whether that new federal security ministry actually gets built and whether any independent verification is announced, because right now, the clock is ticking towards September 30th. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and keep watching how this unprecedented legal strategy unfolds.